near the city of Zwickau, in southern Germany, lies the well-known Swanfield, so called because of the large swanery situated within it. On the gentle slope of a hill that overlooked this little lake, and amidst the high rocks, dwelt a pious hermit named Benno. He had taken this name from that of the celebrated bishop of Misnia. Nobody could say who Benno really was, or whence he came. He had come there some years before, a strong, robust pilgrim, and settled down in the neighborhood of the Swanery. Here he erected with his own hands a comfortable hermitage, and laid out a little garden, in which he planted foreign fruit trees and fine grapevines. He raised also sweet melons, which at that time were held as a great delicacy. With these products of his garden he entertained all who came to see him. His great hospitality, as well as his exceeding good humor, made him beloved by all. Those who dwelt in his neighborhood went to see him in all their troubles, great or small, to receive comfort and counsel, which he always gave them gladly. So the years went by, until the time when the Marquis Frederick revolted against the Emperor Albrecht I, and the Swabian army laid waste the eastern coast of Germany. Already age had stripped the venerable Benno's head of its natural covering. What hair yet remained upon it was quite white. He stooped, he leaned heavily upon his cane, and had no longer in the spring strength to weed and dig his garden. He therefore wished to procure an assistant and companion, but it was hard for him to find one who suited his fancy, for age had made him mistrustful and whimsical. An unexpected event gratified his wish, and found him a helpmate on whom he could lean as on a staff. The inhabitants of Misnia had by fraud and in a great battle completely vanquished the Swabians and slaughtered them by hundreds. A panic seized the Swabian army. The call was given, "Let those who can save themselves." Everyone, after the battle, who had 2 feet left, thanked God for his preservation, and made the best possible use of these members to escape from death. Many fled into the adjoining woods, and the remainder concealed themselves in the meadows. 7 Swabians, the remnant of one faithful company of spearmen, swore to abide faithful to each other, never to be divided, but in unity to live or die. They succeeded, luckily, in escaping from their pursuers. They were all strong young men, whom no foot soldiers could have outrun. At last, however, they were completely fagged out by their long-continued flight. As the night came on, they consulted together as to where they were most likely to find some place of shelter and concealment. They did not consider themselves secure in the open fields. They therefore determined to go to a village close at hand, and there to carefully conceal themselves, for they rightly conjectured that the Misnian troops had chosen that village for their encampment. The 7 heroes were, therefore, very cautious, and hid themselves in the immense, unused oven of the village inn. Now, an oven is, indeed, not the most comfortable of beds. Before their great defeat, they would certainly not have been content with such quarters for the night, but by this time they were ready to make the best of a necessity. Their extreme fatigue soon brought sleep and rest to their weary limbs and troubled minds. The unfortunate companions slept as soundly as if they were on the most luxurious beds, with naught to trouble or disturb them. But alas, before the 7 sleepers awoke, they had already been discovered by a peasant woman. Already the news of the victory had spread throughout the land. In her great joy at the result of the battle, this woman had mixed a large cake, which she intended to bake early in the morning. So when she came to the oven and observed the soldiers quartered there, she perceived at once by their tattered coats that these strange guests were fugitives from the vanquished army. With all haste she ran to the village and told the news to her neighbors. At once a great troop of peasant women gathered together, armed with spits and oven forks, to besiege the oven and its contents. They first held a council as to whether the enemy should be attacked with their weapons or by fire, for they were all determined that the 7 Swabians should die. After some debate, they decided to use their weapons. The strange weapons of attack in the hands of the village women instilled in them the spirit of revenge. The whole crowd rushed in with violence upon the hero's hiding place, and heedless of the laws and rights of hospitality, the defenseless fugitives were awakened from their refreshing sleep by heavy blows and thrusts from the oven forks. By this unfriendly morning greeting, they realized their great danger, and poured forth their expostulations and entreaties from the oven, praying most earnestly for their lives. But the inflexible women would not hear of mercy, and stabbed and beat the poor prisoners, helpless and imprisoned in the oven, until one of them lay still in death, and his unhappy companions were motionless in their curious dungeon. Then the women secured the stove door on the outside and marched triumphantly back to their homes. 6 of the soldiers had really, after this oven skirmish, remained shut up, but the 7th one, who was more ingenious and determined than the others, contrived to escape from their fate. Searching for some way of escape, he took his flight up the chimney, climbed to the roof unperceived, thence slid down and was free. With all the strength he possessed, he ran to the nearest woods and wandered about in continual fear of pursuit and death until the sun had set. At last, from fatigue and hunger, he sank down under a forest oak, and when, after a short time, the cool evening breezes had refreshed him, and in a measure revived his strength, he raised his eyes and saw at a little distance from him a devout hermit, who before a ruined wooden cross was saying his prayers. This pious sight gave him courage. With humble reverence he approached the worthy man, knelt down behind him, and when the monk had finished his devotions, he extended to the stranger his blessing. When, however, he saw the pale and disfigured face and tattered clothes, the monk concluded that he was a shield-bearer of the vanquished army, and entered into conversation with him. The honest Swabian related to him his sad story with unaffected candor, without concealing his great fear of death, for he had always thought of the destroying angel with extreme terror. The good-natured hermit grieved for the innocent Swabian blood which had been shed, and he offered the stranger shelter and protection in his dwelling. To the frightened fugitive, the entrance to the gloomy grotto appeared like a bomb-proof. Not only the rocky vaults, but even the chapel, the larder, and the hermit's cellar, which was indeed a natural cave, all appeared in his eyes in the shape of a large oven. One cold shiver after another crept over him. But the kind old man soon encouraged him. He brought the poor fugitive water to wash his feet, set before him good bread and some garden fruit for his evening meal, moistened with wine the dry tongue, which clave to the roof of his mouth, and prepared for him a couch of soft moss. Friedbert, for that was our Swabian's name, slept soundly until the next morning, when he was awakened by the pious Benno for prayers. By the time breakfast was over, he had forgotten all his fear and grief, and could not find words enough to thank his kind host for all he had done for him. After 3 days of the hermit's hospitality, it seemed to Friedbert, the Swabian, time to leave the hermitage, and yet he longed with all his heart to remain in this secure and peaceful retreat until the land was again quiet. Benno, on his part, found the worthy Swabian possessed of so much good sense, so faithful and of such service to him in household duties, that he wished him to live there always. And so, the wishes of both agreeing, it was determined that Friedbert should remain with the hermit. He accordingly changed his soldier's dress for a monk's habit, and acted as a lay brother in the hermitage, to take care of his aged protector, to attend to the garden and cooking, and to minister to the wants of pilgrims. About the time of the solstice, when the spring yields to summer, Benno never failed to send his faithful servant daily to the swanery, to notice and bring him back word if any swans were to be seen on the pond, to observe their motions, and particularly to note the number together at one time. The old man was always much interested in the report. These accounts of the swans seemed to cheer him greatly, but when, at the usual time, Friedbert brought back the news that no swans were to be seen on the pond, the aged man shook his head sadly, and remained for some days downcast and melancholy. The faithful Swabian was much grieved, and still more surprised at this change in the old man. He therefore visited the swanery constantly, that he might bring him better news. One day, as Friedbert stood near the pond in the twilight, he saw some swans hover over the water. This he immediately reported to Benno, who at the news gave signs of the greatest joy. He had a far more sumptuous supper prepared than usual, and set wine upon the table. Both drank freely, and the good wine gave new strength and spirits to monk and soldier. The worthy Benno threw off entirely his sad gravity, and became cheerful and talkative. He refilled his brother's glass to the brim, and this done, he spoke to him in the following words.
"My son, you have now served me faithfully for 3 long years. It is time, therefore, you should receive some pay. But first, I will tell you the story of my life and my adventures at the Swan Pond, which ripples and dances before our eyes in the breezes and the moonlight like a silver sea. In my youth, I was an impetuous, dauntless knight. My native land was in Switzerland, and I was a descendant of the Earl of Keyburg. For a murder which I rashly committed, I traveled to Rome, to be shriven by our Holy Father the Pope. He laid upon me as penance the command that I should join a crusade to the Holy Land and fight against the Saracens, with the strict injunction that I was never to return home, and that all my property was to be handed over to the church. I took passage on a Venetian ship and left port in good spirits, for fighting was but pleasure to me. But a contrary wind took possession of our sails. The sea grew rough. Our little ship became a plaything in the hands of the waves, and was dashed against a projecting rock near the island of Naxos with such force that she went to pieces. As I was a good swimmer, I managed to reach shore, where I was received kindly by the inhabitants. I then went to Crisa, to the palace of Prince Zeno, and was welcomed there under the assumed name of a French knight. There I saw the prince's daughter, Helena, and soon forgot my vow to join the crusade. All my energy, all my powers were centered on one thing, namely, to please the young princess. My love for her grew stronger every hour. I showed her 1,000 little attentions, and did all in my power to make the charming Helena return my love. By careful inquiry, I learned that on court days she always wore drapery and ornaments of the color of my helmet, plume, and scarf. She loved songs and music, and also lively round dances. She herself danced most charmingly. I often joined her, for a short time, when she was walking alone by the riverside, or when she strolled by the dim light of the soft blue evening sky in her flower garden. But her father, Prince Zeno, was positively opposed to my wooing, and as I would not desist from pressing my suit, I was one day seized by his bodyguard and dragged away. Near the sea coast, on a high projecting rock, stood a strongly built tower, not more than a stone's throw distant from the island, and only accessible by means of a drawbridge, which was always guarded by soldiers. I was pushed into this dismal dungeon down a gigantic ladder, which, as soon as my feet had reached the ground, was drawn up. Perfect darkness reigned in this death-like hole, and a damp, earthy closeness almost stupefied my senses. I soon perceived that I was in the jaws of death, for as I sought a place in which to lie down and die, I stumbled over some human bones which lay scattered on the ground, and on a half-mouldered basket. In despair, I laid me down on the hard stones and cried unto death that he would free me from this living grave. But he sent this time his brother, Sleep, who for a time made me forget my sorrow. When I awoke, I saw, to my amazement, a light shining in the midst of the darkness. When I approached it, I found it to be a burning lamp fastened in a basket which seemed to have been let down from above by means of a rope. I examined the basket and found in it all kinds of choice food and some bottles of wine, also an oil jug with which to feed the lamp. The light at once revealed to me all the horrors of this frightful dungeon, so that the satisfying of my appetite was dearly paid for by the loathsome sights which by the light of the lamp met my eyes. I, however, gathered together some of the empty baskets which lay on the ground, and formed out of them a table and seat. I then fell to on the contents of the basket and made a hearty meal. After some days, so it seemed to me, For time in that subterranean cage had leaden wings. I heard a noise above me. The ladder with the numberless steps came rolling down, and I saw a man descend on it, whom I took for either a fellow-sufferer or an executioner. My joy was equal to my surprise when I recognized a friend of mine, the physician of Prince Zeno. He had pleaded so hard for me that the prince had granted him my life, with the condition that I immediately left the island of Naxos forever. We ascended quickly from the dungeon to the daylight, and when I took leave, with heartfelt thanks of my rescuer, he imparted to me, as a great secret, the intelligence that Princess Helena was descended from a race of fairies, and possessed the power to become, once every year, a swan. Or, said he, as she expresses it, to put on her swan disguise. She then flies to a far-off pond, whose mysterious virtue preserves her beauty. Now, continued the physician, would it grieve you much to travel to this far-off place, and dwell near the wonderful pond, and there make to the beautiful Helena your confession of love, which she would hardly listen to in Naxos? If this pleases you, I will direct you how to find this pond. Therefore, pay great attention. Far off in the German Empire, at the western end of the great chain of mountains, in the more level part of the mountainous district, the waters of some little streams meet and form a pond, which is called by the inhabitants of that region the Swan Pond. Here Helena delights with her companions to fly and swim in the form of swans. It will not be difficult for you to change these wonderful swans into their natural forms, for their feather robes are fastened on by a feather crown on the head. If you stand on the shore in the early morning hours before the rays of the rising sun have reached the water, or in the evening when the sun has just sunk in the horizon and his fading light yet reddens the heavens, mark well if any swans are to be seen. If it be that they are at that time leaving the water, or the bushes on the shore, you will soon perceive in a neighboring meadow, rich with flowers, a company of beautiful ladies walking up and down, laughing and talking together. Your sharp eyes will soon discover for you whether or not the charming Helena is among the group. If she be there, tarry not, but go and take possession of the feathered robes, which you will find on the shore. You will then have them in your power, for without their winged plumage they cannot fly away. When the physician had finished speaking, I was amazed at what he had said, and knew not whether to believe him, or to think that he had told me a falsehood. His honest, straightforward manner, however, convinced me that he had spoken the truth. When I had thought in silence for some minutes, I answered him with full trust in all that he had told me. Noble friend, conduct me at once to the ship. I will try the adventure you have proposed to me. I will, if needs be, cross the whole world until I find the pond where the greatest wish I have on earth may be realized. Thereupon, I took passage at once and sailed through the Hellespont to Constantinople. There I put on a pilgrim's dress and travelled in company with a real pilgrim who was just returning from the Holy Land. At the first mountain I parted with my companion, and wandered about for a long time, until I found the long-sought Swanery. Here, in its neighborhood, I built this hermitage. It was soon visited by many good people, who, believing me to have just returned from the Holy Land, sought from me the blessing and comfort of a holy man. Soon after I had settled down here, I built that reed hut on the shore, and used at times to lie concealed there, looking out over the water, to spy out in secret the arrival of the swans, for I was certain that the physician had told me the truth. My watchfulness was at last rewarded. About the middle of the summer, I saw swans swimming on the pond. Their forms seemed quite natural, but their loving, affectionate ways to each other seemed more like young maidens than swans. But I could never obtain a glimpse of the object I so longed to see. 3 summers I watched in vain, with impatient hope. The 4th summer came. I watched diligently from my hiding place, and one morning, just at the first dawn of day, I heard a flapping of wings above me. Soon after I saw wandering along the shore of the pond a party of maidens, and as the daylight increased, I saw distinctly among them the form of the beautiful Helena. Oh, my heart beat loudly within my breast. My joy and surprise overruled my better judgment, and I quite forgot the instructions of the physician. Instead of securing the feathered robes and thus obtaining full power to detain the maidens, I raised my voice in the ecstasy of my delight, and cried out loudly, "Helena of Naxos, do you not recognize your faithful knight, whom love has driven here to dwell by this wonderful pond in hopes of again meeting you?" The maidens seemed greatly terrified at this unexpected call. They raised a great cry of alarm, rushed into the reeds, and soon after, reappearing in the form of 7 swans, flew high up in the air and disappeared. I now lamented my foolish impetuosity. I rent my dress, tore out my hair, and showed in many other insane ways my frantic grief, until my wild excitement lost itself in grim despair. I went sadly back to my lonely cloister, and there thought of nothing but of my sorrow and bitter regret. Many years now I have lived here without any news of Helena, or her visits to the pond, for which I have so anxiously waited. All I can think is that the Fairy of Beauty was driven from the pond by my thoughtlessness. In time, the maidens came again and again to the pond, and in that rested all my hope. I watched carefully and with pleasure their every movement, but the noble Helena was never among them. Under this false hope, time has bent my back and marked deep furrows on my brow. Even now the movements of the swans interest me as much as ever, for they always remind me of the adventure of my youth and of the happiest dream of my life. Yet I do not wish, Friedbert,
continued Benno to his attentive listener,
that you, a robust youth, should dream away your life in this desolate place. The short time that yet remains to me on earth you may abide with me. But when you have done for me the last service which earthly hands can do, and laid my bones in the grave which I myself many years ago hewed in the rocks, then you shall go out into the world, and by honesty and virtue earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. But before you go, you may try your luck and see if here, by this pond, you can win a swan maiden for a faithful, loving bride.
The morning had already begun to dawn when the communicative old man finished his story and stretched himself out on his bed of dry leaves and sought at last to take his night's rest. But no sleep came to Friedbert's eyes. He sat himself down before the hermit's door and watched the rising sun. In fancy he saw a swan in every swallow that flew above him. After the night's exertion, Father Benno laid down upon his bed. He fell asleep, and that night he died. He was buried by his faithful companion, amid great lamentations from all the good people of the neighborhood. They truly mourned from their hearts the loss of the venerable monk, and ever after regarded his grave as a sacred spot. All were clamorous to obtain some small relic of the hermit. Friedbert cut in small pieces the monk's old cloak and hawthorn staff to divide among them as keepsakes. In time, the crowd dispersed. Friedbert, now owner of the hermitage, could indulge in his own thoughts without interruption. He watched with great pleasure the days becoming longer, the nights shorter, and midsummer drawing near. He went diligently to the pond from the time of the summer solstice, and in the morning and evening hours hid himself in the reed hut. At last, one evening, he made the long-wished-for discovery. 3 swans came flying from the south with noisy flapping of their wings. 3 times they circled round above the pond as if to observe that all was safe. Then they plunged into the water and swam merrily along, leaving deep silver ripples behind them in the clear tide at every stroke of their wings. They began to sport and play in the water like children, chasing each other round the pond in turn. When they had finished their games in the water, they swam to the shore and disappeared in the high reeds. The watchful and eager Friedbert soon saw reappearing from among the reeds 3 beautiful young maidens, clad in costly robes, ornamented with gold and silver. As they stood there for a minute, with their arms entwined around one another, they formed the prettiest picture he had ever gazed upon. They wandered over to the neighboring flower meadows. They sprang merrily here and there with joyful shouts of pleasure, picked the prettiest flower blossoms, laid themselves down in the soft grass, and wove sweet-smelling garlands and wreaths. Soft strains of music were wafted by the breezes to Friedbert in his concealment, and his spying eyes soon saw the fairy-like maidens, decked all over with garlands of fresh flowers, moving lightly to and fro in a merry dance. Although lost in admiration at this beautiful sight, yet Friedbert plucked up his courage at the right minute and hastily left his hiding-place. Unperceived, he slipped down through the bushes to the spot where the young maidens had laid their plumage. When he came in sight of the feathered robes, his heart leapt for joy. With an eager hand, the bold robber seized the handsomest of the swan robes and hastened with his booty to the hermitage, full of impatient expectations as to what fate had laid out as his destiny. As soon as he had hidden his treasure in an iron chest, he sat down on a rustic bench, just outside the hermitage grotto, to continue his observations. The maidens at last, tiring of dancing and play, went hand in hand across the meadows toward the pond. When they had disappeared in the reeds, there arose a cry of horror, and immediately 2 swans flew out from the reeds in a frightened manner, and soaring high up in the air, flew rapidly away. Friedbert soon heard a slight noise, as of a timid footstep in the sand. Its motions betrayed fear. When the cunning young hermit saw that he was being observed, he assumed a careless attitude as if he saw and heard nothing. As he casually raised his eyes, there stood before him the charming, captured maiden, with an expression of deep distress upon her countenance. She opened her mouth with anxious, entreating gestures, and the young hermit heard a sweet, melodious voice, which was pleasant to his ears. But not one word that the maiden uttered could he understand, for the language in which she spoke was strange to him. He, however, easily guessed the purport of her words to be an earnest supplication for the restoration of the stolen swan robe. The roguish hermit purposely misunderstood her gestures, and only endeavored to make her understand that she had nothing to fear in that sacred hermitage. He set before her the finest fruit, and did everything in his power to assuage her grief. But the distressed maiden seemed to care for nothing. She sank down in a corner, and appeared utterly overcome with her affliction. The sympathizing Friedbert took her grief so to heart that he could not restrain his own tears. The beautiful foreigner felt somewhat comforted by this apparent sympathy. She spoke freely to him of the stolen robe, and begged his pardon for her former suspicion of him. She tried very hard to find some means of making the cause of her grief intelligible to her host, for Friedbert seemed to have no idea of what she was saying, or what was the cause of her sorrow. The night passed in the hermitage very sadly. But as the morning light ever brings comfort and relief to those in grief, so now the rosy finger of dawn dried the tears which the fair maiden had been shedding all through the night. Friedbert did everything that he thought would best please his beautiful guest. She partook but slightly of the tempting breakfast which he set before her. Then she went out to search again on the shore of the pond for the lost swan robe, for she thought perchance the wind might have blown it in among the shrubbery. The obliging Friedbert accompanied her in the search, although he well knew that it was a useless trouble. The unsuccessful search indeed brought the tears afresh into the eyes of the fair one, but her companion did his utmost to soothe her grief. She became by degrees more resigned to her fate. Her sad eyes grew brighter, and she expressed delight in the companionship of the hermit, for whose kindness she was very grateful. The sly young hermit noticed all this with great pleasure, and by every little attention exerted himself more and more to win for himself her good opinion. Little by little they both learned, by signs and by speech, to understand each other well, so that they grew more and more companionable. Friedbert learned from the maiden that she was of noble birth, being the youngest daughter of Prince Theodore and the beautiful Helena of Naxos, and that her name was Callist. He begged her to allow him to call her Swanhilde, and she had no objection to offer. Indeed, she seemed to be rather pleased with the soft sound of the name. "Tell me, good hermit," said she one day, "what is the secret history of this pond, and why did my mother always warn her daughters against flying hither? Did she ever in this place have the misfortune to lose her swan robe? She used to send us every year to the waters of the Nile, but my elder sisters wished, at least once, to take their airy journey toward the north. Youth and thoughtlessness made them forget the maternal warning. They believed the fresher air and cool breezes of this region would be more refreshing to them than the hot atmosphere of the Egyptian deserts. During the first journey, in which they disregarded their mother's wishes, all passed off well. And after she died, we thoughtlessly took this journey yearly, until I, unfortunate one, have become the victim of my elder sister's indiscretion. Ah, where does the cruel magician conceal himself, who, taking pleasure in the misfortune of others, spies out an unsuspecting maiden and robs her of her only means of returning home? Tell me, who is this wicked wretch, that I may force him to give me back my own? It cannot be of any use to him, and yet it is of so much importance to me." Friedbert was rejoiced not a little at the mistaken idea of the angry Swanhilde, who thought that some magician had committed the theft, and he took pains to strengthen her in her delusion. He invented for her a story of a disguised prince, who was, he said, reported to inhabit the Swanfield, and who, taking a malicious delight in others' grief, found great pleasure in stealing the plumage of the swan maidens, and then mocking and ridiculing them in their helplessness. He at the same time gave her to understand that he had learned how some years ago a swan maiden had lost her plumage on that very spot, but she had found it again, and so it had soon been forgotten. His attentive listener seemed comforted by this story, but the lack of all the pleasures and comforts of life in this deserted place did not suit the lovely princess, and her young heart pined to go out into the busy world. The sly Swabian did not at once consent to this wish. At last, however, he determined to leave the hermitage with her. He gave her to understand that for the sacrifice it would be to him to return to the noise and bustle of the world, nothing could repay him but the great charms and vast wealth which she possessed. As she seemed to silently consent to this, he the next day gathered together all his portable property, attired himself again as a soldier, and set forth with his beautiful betrothed on the way toward his home. There was a little town in Swabia called Egglingen. In this little town lived Friedbert's mother, who was a widow. She hallowed the memory of her dead husband and cursed the Misnians, who had, she thought, slain her son. Whenever a maimed soldier, returning from the Misnian war, stopped before her door to ask for alms, she would always give him a groschen and inquire if he knew anything of her son. If he happened to be a loquacious fellow of an inventive mind, he would perhaps make up some story about her son, how he had fought bravely in the battle and had fallen as a hero, or how he had sent a farewell to his mother with his last breath as he lay on the field of bloodshed. Then the good mother would bring the impostor into her house and set wine before him, as a friend of her lamented son, her eyes brimming over afresh at the thought of her boy's last hours. In this way, 4 summers had passed over her, and the autumnal winds had set in, when the little town was awakened one day by the arrival of a messenger, announcing that Friedbert had not been slain in battle, but was even then returning from foreign lands well equipped, that he had met with many wonderful adventures in the neighborhood of Misnia, and was now on his way home, bringing with him a most beautiful bride, who was the daughter of a great prince and possessed vast treasures. The report spread everywhere. The fact was that Friedbert had acquired great wealth by inheriting all Father Benno's savings, and also by the large sums of money which some of the people had paid him for little relics of the old hermit. As he traveled on towards Swabia, from place to place he increased his train. He bought horses and mules with handsome trappings, attired himself and the beautiful Swanhilde in elegant robes, hired servants and attendants, and travelled on as proudly as a prince. When the inhabitants of Eglingen saw, in the far distance, the procession leaving the gates of Augsburger and travelling toward their town, they all assembled at the town gate with huzzas and shouts of triumph. Friedbert's sisters and their husbands, together with all the members of the town council and the other chief people of Eglingen, went out to meet their newly found fellow townsman. They welcomed him with drums and fifes and all kinds of music and rejoicing, as if he had risen from the dead. The fond mother embraced her son with joy unbounded. She invited all her friends and acquaintances to a great feast of thanksgiving, and distributed alms freely among the poor. She could never weary of admiring the exquisite form of her future daughter-in-law, and loading her with caresses. Indeed, she quite tired the lovely maiden with her well-meant attentions. The beautiful princess of Naxos soon became the talk of the town and all the neighboring country. Many knights and nobles rode thither, called the lucky Friedbert brother and cousin, sought his company and swore eternal friendship to him. But he kept the charming Swanhilde from seeing all these would-be admirers, and left her to the faithful care of his loving mother. At every opportunity, and with all the ardor he possessed, Friedbert pleaded with her for the fulfillment of his greatest wish, and the beautiful foreigner, having no hopes of ever being able to return to her native land, overlooked the great difference between their respective stations in life, and at last consented to become his bride. He presented her with costly bridal raiment. The day for their marriage was appointed. The fatted calf and the capons were slain, and the wedding feast prepared. On the day before the wedding, the bridegroom-elect rode through the neighboring country to invite the guests to the marriage feast. In his absence, the lovely Swanhilde occupied the time in arranging her wedding attire, for woman's vanity enticed her to try on the new dress to see if it were becoming to her. As there were many things about the robe which did not suit her fancy, she was obliged to seek the advice of her future mother-in-law. The talkative old mother came at once when called, and immediately poured forth a torrent of praises over the exquisite form of the graceful maiden and the beauty of the bridal costume. Yet Swanhilde was not contented with the robe. Especially did she find fault with the awkward set of the bridal veil, which she compared to a coarse waterproof. "Said she with a sigh, that my wedding attire could be adorned by one of the veils of Naxos, which float in the air like the lightest snow cloud. Then would every maiden in the town envy me, and Friedbert's chosen one would be praised as the most beautiful of brides." Tears of grief trickled down the maiden's bright cheeks at the reference to her home, which she feared she would never see again. The good mother was very much moved at this, for she believed the tears of a bride to be a bad omen. She comforted Swanhilde by promising to give her a silver bandeau, which had once adorned her own head in her youth, and with which she could fasten on the veil in the Grecian style. She hastily opened an old chest which contained her jewelry, and began to rummage about in it for the silver bandeau. Swanhilde watched her movements with some attention. Suddenly she spied at the bottom of the chest her own shining white swan plumage. Quickly she pushed aside the old mother, dragged up her priceless treasure, dashed open the window, and as she threw the light feather robe around her slight form, she became a swan. Then she spread her wings and flew joyfully out of the window. The astonished old woman became motionless with horror at this transmutation, for Friedbert had entrusted to her care the swan robe without imparting to her its wonderful secret. He had only told her to keep it at the bottom of the chest for safety. The old woman fell on her knees and prayed for protection, for she thought the beautiful Swanhilde was nothing more than a sprite or some devil's trick. Friedbert, little dreaming of the sad news that awaited him on his return, came riding joyfully home towards evening. He alighted quickly from his horse, and hastening up the steps without waiting to unfasten his spurs, he entered the hall to greet his bride. But as he opened the door, his mother, wailing loudly, hastened to meet him, and recounted to him the sad and wonderful occurrence of the morning. He listened to his mother's narrative with consternation. When she had concluded, he rent his clothes, tore his hair, and acted as if he were distracted, weeping as if his heart would break. The bridegroom, without a bride, found his condition unbearable. There is scarcely a more painful situation than to be shipwrecked just before entering the harbor, when one believes he has traveled safely around the world. It is quite as painful a situation to lose on the very evening before the wedding day a most fondly loved bride. Had she eloped with a robber? Had she, by the advice of some hard-hearted monk, entered a cloister? The bridegroom was at a loss to answer, but he determined to hunt down the robber, whoever he might be, and rescue the fair captive from his grasp, or to bring her out through the fast-closed portals of the nunnery. But she had flown out of the window and high up in the air. Whither then should he hasten after her, or who could give him any clue? Friedbert, after meditating for some time, saw no other way to get possession of his truant bride than to traverse both land and sea until he found the hiding place of his beloved. His impatient longing for Swanhilde made him reflect with great sadness on the vast distance between the Swabian land and the island of Naxos. "Ah," he cried out in utter despair, "how can a miserable snail follow the light-winged lark, while the snail, unsteady and uncertain, toils along from one flower to another, never knowing where he will go next? Who can say surely that Swanhilde has flown back to Naxos, and even if she is now there, what good can that do me?
Could I dare to aspire to the hand of the daughter of the prince of the land?
With these reflections, the broken-hearted bridegroom tormented himself for many days, until his unconquerable longing for his bride drove him at last to a hasty resolution. Saddling his best horse, he took with him a large sum of money for his traveling expenses, and after bidding his mother an affectionate farewell, he rode away from his home and galloped quickly over his native lands toward the far-off island. As he rode, he recalled to mind the way in which Father Benno had reached the island. Taking the same route as the latter, Friedbert likewise, after a long sea voyage, only without shipwreck, arrived safe and sound at the island of Naxos. Here Prince Theodore, Swanhilde's father, yet swayed the scepter. The beautiful Helena, his partner in joy and woe, had long since slept her last sleep. Friedbert sprang on land with joy. He trod with boundless rapture upon the native soil of his truant bride, whom he hoped to find again in her father's palace. He tried at once to get some information concerning the beautiful Swanhilde's hiding place, but no one could tell him whither the princess had vanished. This grieved him beyond measure, and he was uncertain whether he should return to his hermitage by the Swanery, or seek his lost prize on the banks of the Nile. While he was turning over in his mind what he had best do, a neighboring prince, who was soon to be married to Princess Irene, one of Swanhilde's sisters, arrived at the court of Naxos. Prince Theodore had prepared a magnificent marriage feast, and the ceremonies were to be concluded by a great tournament. This news revived in the Swabian hero all his war courage. Tormented as he was with melancholy and depression, he sought for some diversion. This relief he hoped to find in the coming contest. In the market of the city and at all the cross streets, heralds proclaimed the day and hour of the tournament, and especially invited all foreign knights to attend and try their skill. Friedbert provided himself with a sparkling new suit of armor. He purchased at a high price a valiant steed, and on the stated day, at the appointed time, he appeared in the court, and without delay entered his name in the lists. In the first course, he broke the lance of his adversary with great skill. He kept his seat firmly in the saddle and earned by his bravery and tact the praises of all present, receiving congratulations from the newly married prince and princess. The tournament was followed by a series of charming dances. Although everything swam in a stream of pleasure and excitement, yet Friedbert did not allow himself to be carried away in the whirl of enjoyment. In the midst of the noise of the gay court life, with songs and mummings and lively dances, he bore on his face the marks of his deep grief. His longing for his beautiful bride remained undiminished, and the Grecian maidens adorned themselves in vain for the stranger knight. One day, the bride, Princess Irene, began to banter him about his indifferent manner. "Unfeeling knight, is your heart quite free and yet insensible to all love and affection, that the blooming faces of the beautiful maidens of my court make no impression on you? Why do you often wander off alone and so sadly, when you are everywhere invited to participate in all the gay festivities of the court? Pray tell me your trouble, that I may see if it is in my power to help you in any way, for I see that you have some great hidden grief."
Your kind thoughtfulness, noble Irene,
replied Friedbert,
sees into the depth of my soul. You conjecture rightly that I bear in my breast the deepest affliction, and I know not whether I dare cherish the idea of my grief being turned into joy, or whether I must abandon all hopes forever. The lovely maiden whose charms hold me prisoner, mind and soul, moves not in the circle of your train. Nevertheless, I have found her in your father's palace, but alas, only in the form of what may be, perhaps, but the glowing imagination of an artist. And yet it seems to me incredible that any painter could produce such a work had not the master hand of nature first drawn those angelic features for him to copy from.
The princess was impatient to learn which picture had made so deep an impression on the heart of the young knight. "Follow me thither at once," said she, "that I may see if the charming features really belong to a maiden whom I know." In the castle there was an exquisite collection of paintings. Some were only fancies of celebrated painters, while others were family portraits. Among these was a picture of Swanhilde. When they entered the gallery, Friedbert rushed with ardent impetuosity to the beloved picture, and said, half lost in contemplation,
"Behold, here, the chosen of my heart. Where can I find her? Upon your lips hangs my life or death. Speak, I adjure you. If all my past hopes are vain, so let me die at your feet. But if you can give me one ray more of that blessed hope, then reveal to me among what people or in what land is this angel of beauty, that I may travel thither to seek out the joy of my heart, and by toil and deeds of fearless bravery win her affection, cost what it may."
The princess seemed much embarrassed by this disclosure. Her face became grave, and she spoke as follows. "Thoughtless man, how can you give your heart to a maiden in a picture without knowing if she be alive or not? And if living, whether she is of a companionable age for you and could return your love? Your imagination has indeed this time not quite led you astray, for this lovely face is neither a fancy of the painter nor yet a beauty of past ages, but it is the face of a young maiden who is very near and dear to me. Alas, once she lived in this castle, my dearest sister, but now she is miserable, a slave to misfortune. She could never return your affection, for she has already given her heart to a worthless wretch who is separated from her by many 100 miles, for she had the courage to escape from the snare that he had set for her. She nevertheless loved him, and now mourns over her ill fate in the solitude of a cloister." Friedbert feigned to be terribly shocked at this communication, but secretly rejoiced that he had discovered his bride's retreat, and yet more that he had received from the sister's lips the unexpected assurance of the princess's love for him. He entreated the kind-hearted Princess Irene to relate to him the story of her dear sister's misfortunes. She yielded to his request with a half-true and half-invented story, but Friedbert, knowing it already, could without much trouble separate the truth from the fiction. "My sister," said she, "was wandering about on the coast of the sea, driven beyond the safety of the walls around her father's palace by curiosity to visit some unknown spot. Hidden behind a sand mound on the curve of the shore A pirate boat lay at anchor. The merry girl never thought of danger. Suddenly a pirate sprang out from the boat, hastily overtook the frightened girl, and carried her in his arms to his boat, in which he at once sailed out into the broad sea. He tried by 1,000 little attentions and flatteries to win her affection, and so at last succeeded in stealing her heart. She forgot her noble birth, and was on the very point of becoming united to the crafty pirate in the sacred and indissoluble bond of matrimony. Just then, the wind blew a small ship close to the pirate boat. My sister thought of her native land and of the bitter tears which were being shed for her at home. Yielding to the impulse, she cried out loudly to be rescued from the pirates, and by the help of those on board the ship, she escaped from her captors. But the strong affection for the pirate, which had already taken possession of her heart, was implanted deeply there and could not be rooted out. The separation from him, though her own act, caused her pain and regret. All her former joyousness vanished. Her bright eyes lost their luster, and distress and regret are now fast sinking her into her grave.
"Then,"
exclaimed Friedbert,
"so shall her grave be also mine. My life is in my own hands, and who is he that shall hinder me from dying with the lovely princess? I beseech of you only one favor, namely to see that my body is buried next to hers, that at least in death we may be together. Yet allow me first the comfort of acknowledging to her that she is the light of my eyes, the chosen of my heart."
The Princess Irene was so moved by these words that she could not restrain her tears. She promised to comply with his request, and provided him with a scroll to the abbess of the nunnery, begging her to allow the bearer of the same a private interview with the Princess Caliste. Friedbert mounted his steed immediately. Wavering between doubt and hope, he spurred the animal to his fastest gallop, to learn as soon as possible how his former bride would receive him. All things taken into consideration, he had reason to believe she had forgiven him for the robbery of her swan robe. With a beating heart, he entered the cell of the lovely maiden. She sat on a low stool just opposite the cell door. Her curling hair fell in soft ringlets over her shoulders, only loosely fastened back by a narrow silk band. Her head rested on her lily-white arms. She seemed to be in the deepest distress. She was evidently not aware that anyone was approaching her cell, but as Friedbert prostrated himself at her feet, she raised her tearful eyes and recognized her lover. He seized her fair hand with rapture and implored her, with all the ardor of his nature, to forgive him for the stealing of her plumage. The assurance and proof that he had followed her from Swabia to the distant island of Naxos, and from there to the cloister, gained for him full forgiveness, and the beautiful princess promised to share the rest of her life with him. To have won the victory after so many hardships and disappointments plunged the enraptured Friedbert into transports of delight. He could scarcely realize the blessed truth that Swanhilde was indeed his for life. Half beside himself with joy, and in company with his beloved bride, he hastened back to her father's palace. The Princess Irene was amazed beyond expression that her sorrowing sister had so very suddenly given up her resolution to pass the rest of her life in seclusion, entirely cut off from the society of men. She embraced her tenderly, and with fervent joy welcomed her back to her home. Friedbert had, by his knightly bearing and pleasant manners, won the universal esteem and affection of the people of Naxos. Prince Theodore, Swanhilde's father, overlooked therefore all difference of rank and birth, and willingly gave his consent to the marriage of his daughter to the Swabian. More than all, Friedbert could depend upon his own good sword. This was ever ready and in hand to defend against any man his name and birth. Friedbert remained on the beautiful island of Naxos. His old mother was escorted thither by an ambassador. Thereafter she spent her days with her noble son, and there he lived with his noble wife many happy years. The lovely Swanhilde always thought with delight and gratitude of the bold robbery of her swan plumage. It had brought her, she declared, to such a happy and loving union.